right, so now that we have some basic tools under our belt with the insert edge loop and extrude, we're going to go ahead and make a model. I'm going to start with a fresh scene. I'm just going to come up here to new scene, and we're going to find ourselves some reference. So I'm going to come over here and I'm going to look up Unsplash. That way I can get a royalty-free image that we can use. And we're going to start out with something like a mason jar or some sort of a jar here to begin with. So what I want to find is a jar with a lid that I can look at. That's, somewhat modern. So this could work well. I don't really like all the details, but it should suit our needs. Now, with Pure Ref Up, I'm just going to copy this and paste it into here. So I'm just going to right click copy, and then I'm going to come in here and paste. If you have access to a jar, feel free to grab one, or you could just come into Unsplash, find this jar, use it. You could even screen capture this now. That way you have the reference. Now, what I want you to do is I want you to watch me do this first, okay? I like to use something called a gradual release format when I'm teaching concepts. That's the I do, you do, we do. So I'm going to do it first. I want you to watch. I want you to listen. I want you to actively take notes. You could do that with pen and paper, or you can do it on your Microsoft Word document or whatever typewriting document you want. Then what I want you to do is go back through and do it with me. Follow along with the recording. If you get stuck, fire up the recording, figure out where you're stuck, and use that to help guide you. And then lastly, I want you to create some sort of a jar of your own. It doesn't even have to be this style of jar. You could create a magic potion. You could make a large jar, a small jar, whatever you want, okay? So let's go ahead and get started with this one. Now that I have my reference set up and I have it on my other screen, we're going to begin the process of modeling. The first thing you want to do when modeling is you want to establish what primitive to begin with. So if I'm doing a jar, we can think of the base shape we need to create a jar-like structure, and that is going to be a cylinder. So this is going to be a really good start point. The other thing to think about is how we're going to deal with different structures. So for example, we have a lid and we have a cylinder here. So these are generally going to be two different objects. We want to model them separately because if we were going to animate them, the lid would have to come off of the jar, all right? So we can already determine that. Now let's get started with our cylinder. I'm going to come up here to create polygon primitives and just grab a cylinder. And I'm going to move this so that it is on the grid. A couple things we can do. We can hit D to move the pivot. So remember, that's how we move pivots, and V to snap to vertex. So I can snap that to the vertice, and then X to move this up. And I'm just going to scale it to be about the right width, and then scale it up to get along the right height that I want to have here. Now, the next thing we need to do is we need to start explore shaping the jar here a bit. So we kind of have this base cylinder here. We can approach this through something like an extrusion by pulling this up, and that would be a good way to go. And then we can scale this inward. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to make this a little bit smaller to represent the jar midsection here. Come into face mode here, and I'll hold tab to tab and select these. And we can come up here to our edit mesh menu and extrude to extrude this upward a bit. So I'm just going to eyeball the extrusion that I need. So maybe right about there. And then we're going to scale this in a bit. Now we can scale this with the offset here to offset it inwards manually, which might be a good practice. You can see I'm using both of those. And I notice this looks a little bit too high, so I'm just going to bring that in a bit, and the angle doesn't quite feel right. So right about there. And then it comes up again. We can use G to repeat the last tool used. So I'm going to hit G here, and we can pull this up just a little. And then if you look at this, there's a little bit of a lip here. Now there's a couple different ways we can approach this lip. What I'm going to do is hit G again and just pull this upward. That way we'll have access to the lip. And then I'm going to hit G once more and pull this up, which is going to give us the other part of the jar, which is going to kind of attach around. Okay. Now, what was the purpose of this? This was to give us a edge row here that we can select. Now, to select this, I'm going to switch to my move tool or my select tool. So you can either hit W or Q. I usually like to use W just because it shows me a gizmo, and I'm going to select the side here. And a quick way to select along a row of faces like this is you can move, and if you shift double click along that row, Maya should be smart enough to know you want to go from point A to B. So what I'm doing is just shift, double click, and you'll see it's going to go from point A to B, shift, double click, point A to B, Shift, double click, point A to B. And then we can do an edit mesh extrude, and we can just pull this out slightly to create that outer lip, like so. And if we wanted to, we could scale this in a bit. And this is where the scale gizmo comes in. I know the direction I want to scale it in is in this green axis Y. I can just scale that slightly, and then I can continue to move it to shape it. And you'll see now we're getting that nice top portion to the lid. Now, the bottom is also a factor. It has this sort of lifted area here. What we're going to want to do there potentially is get a nice sort of rounded base. And we can do that by coming down here to the bottom. And with our selection tool active, I'm going to switch to Q. We can tab to move these in. And we can scale this in using extrusion. So I'm going to go ahead and do an edit mesh extrude. We can then scale this by clicking on one of these and scaling inward. And that will give us a little bit of a ledge, like so. We can then go into edge mode, double click this edge, and just move this up slightly to create that nice base. And there you go. We're starting to have a nice looking jar. Now, if I wanted this to be a bit more rounded, we could insert an edge loop and we could scale that outward. If we wanted it to be right in the middle, we could use a multi-edge loop, delete the two remaining and extrude that. So we could come up here to Mesh Tools, insert edge loop, go into the options. I could set multi and set it to 3. That way it's right in the middle. Click right down here. Go ahead and reset that. Right click into edge, double click the ones I don't need. Oops, I still had my edge loop selected. Make sure you switch out of that. I'm going to hit Q to switch to select. Double select the top, double select the bottom, do an edit mesh, delete edge and vertex. And then we can just take this perfectly centered one and scale it out to give it a bit of roundness. Now, you don't have to do that to that level of precision, but it is nice to have if you do want that. And we could do that up here if we felt it was needed. You'll see there is a bit of roundness here on this edge, and we're not really getting that. So I could come in here and use an insert edge loop, but this time I'll just do it approximate. I'll do it kind of towards the bottom here. Double click this and scale, and just kind of get that to be more rounded. Okay, so we have a nice looking jar so far. Now, some other things that will come up when we get into shading, if we want this to look like glass, is this indent down here. Jars kind of have an indented surface on the bottom. So I want to come to my bottom here, right click into face mode. We're going to tab select these, and we're going to scale them inwards. Now, I want to show you this with using the scale tool, just to kind of reiterate all the different ways we can do this. I know it's a little bit confusing. Use whatever you're comfortable with. But here, I'm going to hold down Shift and scale inward here without even going to my extrude tool. I'm then going to hold Shift and move up. And then I'm going to switch with R to scale and just go ahead and scale this in slightly. This time, not extruding, just kind of giving myself a little bit of a lip there. Now, that might be a little bit too thick for my jar, but I'm just going to go with it for this pass. Okay, this is looking very jar-like. Now, the next thing I might want to do is hollow out my jar. So I'm going to come to the top part here. I'm going to hold down Tab to select all of these. And then we're going to extrude. Now, be careful, because sometimes if you just did a selection, it's still going to be there. Because remember, we never switch tools. So you notice that bottom's still selected. If you do have this, notice my gizmo's in the middle rather than in the middle of that surface. That's how I could tell. So you can click off of the object to clear your selection and then reselect. And if your gizmo is sitting at the middle there, you'll be able to tell that you got it right. Now from here, I'm just going to hold down Shift to create the jar lip. And we'll make that nice and thick, a good thick piece of glass. I'm going to hit W to switch to move, Shift to drag this down. And this is where things can get kind of complicated. Remember, I mentioned that X-ray mode. This could be useful for transparent surfaces if you don't want to apply a material, to just kind of see the thickness of where this is tracking to. And we're going to want to make this follow the inside relatively closely. There's more ways we could make this precise, but for now, we're just going to eyeball it. So that's going to be the first extrusion. Then I'm going to extrude it down to the thick point here. Just kind of pull that out. And if I wanted it to be round, I could move it to there and then just hold down Shift, pull it down to here to get the interior. Then we could hold Shift to move this down to the bottom. And we might want to do a similar setup here where we switch to scale, R, Shift to indent, and then W to move. And then if I turn off X-ray mode, you can see we have a nice hollow inside, nice setup on the outside. So at this point, we have a nice looking jar. We can go ahead and create a lid for this next by coming here to create polygon primitives and coming in here to a cylinder. We can move this upward. From here, we can just scale it to be approximately the circumference to, let's say, the inside. If we think about jars, though, they kind of screw onto the outside here, so we can make it about the same thickness here if we wanted to, and we could extrude it outward. That's an option. So this would get it close enough. With something like this, you're not really going to see it anyway, so I'm not too worried. But we can take a look at our lid here and just scale this to be about the right size. I might do the same thing where I just hit D and V to snap my vertice pivot there. And a neat trick is if you turn on the vertices here and you hold down V and just drag an arrow, you can hover over the area you want it to snap to. So that would be the base here. And we could just go ahead and kind of draw that out. Now, before I start establishing the height, I'm going to establish the depth. I'm going to come around the outside here. I'm just holding down Tab to select all the outside edges. And we're going to extrude. Now this time I'm not going to use the hotkey Shift because I need this to extrude along the component surface. So I need it to push outward. And if I use something like Scale, it's going to push out and up. So this is an instance where I need to come up here to the tool or use the Control-E hotkey. But we can go ahead and hit extrude, and we can just pull this out to have a little bit of thickness, not a whole lot, but enough to kind of give us that lid base. And you'll notice our lid actually has this little bit of a lip here. So I'm going to want to work that into here. But the first one's just kind of to this point. So we're going to extrude that out. So maybe right about there. Now from here, we can continue working this. I can come up to my insert edge loop. So we'll come up here to Mesh Tools, Insert Edge Loop. And I'll just insert an edge loop along here to represent that lip. So we'll come around here, just Shift double click once again. All right, Edit Mesh Extrude. This is going to allow us to pull this out. And then we can scale this in a little bit just to give it that rounded look. And then we can start to shape this structure here. So looking at this, it kind of has this waviness to it. Now you'll notice I can't just grab this and pull this down necessarily. Accidentally grabbing my hotkeys there. I can't just grab this and pull this down necessarily, but in this particular instance I can because we have that extra lip there. So I'm going to do so. Then coming into here, I can select this top area and just make sure I get that side too and pull this down. And there we go. We start to get that sort of lip going. From there, I can just Shift drag to pull this up a bit and scale this inward. And then Shift drag to pull this up and scale this outward because it has this little bit of a lip. And it actually comes out pretty far here. And then Shift drag to add a little top lip there and scale it in. And then Shift drag, scale it in a little bit to match this indent. Then Shift drag this upward and finish off the top part of the lid, which looks something like that. Okay, now if we go ahead and freeze transforms on this, modify freeze transforms, that'll make it so if we zero this out, it comes back to the top. But you can see we have that nice lid there and it matches up to the insides. However, you'll notice we don't have an inside to the lid itself. So we're going to need to come into this space here and hollow this out. I'm just going to right click into face mode, tab to move inward here. And then we're going to start to work on pulling this up. So I'm going to go ahead and just Shift and drag this up. And jars don't really have that big of a lip. So that should be okay. If I wanted to get a little bit more, I could extrude this in again and then extrude this in again, just to kind of match that screw on top. But there you have it. Now we have a nice lid there that can fit on top of our jar. We're not done yet though, because we're going to want to make this able to smooth, but you can see how far we've gotten with just the extrusions here. Okay, so what I want you to do at this point is go ahead and pause and do the you do portion of this, or rather the we do portion, where you follow along and get to this point, and then we're going to take a look at how we can add in that final touch using smooth preview to add subdivision to make it look like a nice polished object. So go ahead and pause and try getting to this point, and then we'll go ahead and take a look at the smoothing. Okay, so we've gotten to this point. We're ready to start smoothing out our model. I'm going to move the lid off the top of the jar, and we'll start with the jar. If I press 3 on the jar, you'll see for the most part it holds up nicely, and it really doesn't have a whole lot of issues. There's just a few areas we might want to make a little bit sharper, but overall you can see how that smoothing helps take it from this very jaggedy, polygonal looking surface to this very refined, almost realistic looking surface. So a couple areas that I'm going to add in edge loops. Along this area to just tighten up these edges so they're not just this mushiness, they have this hardness to it. So let's add some holding edges. We're going to come up here to Mesh Tool, Insert Edge Loop. And remember, to add a holding edge, we just click on one side of the edge and then click on the other. And if I press 3 now, you'll see what we get is a nice sharp edge there, where that's no longer mushing over. It has that nice crispness to it. And if I take a look at these two in silhouette mode, you can see how the edge with the holding edges has this really nice, almost 90-degree angle into this curve. And the one lacking it has this really dramatic curve here. So let's add that and compare to the bottom here. We're going to come in here and do an insert edge loop. And I'll just go ahead and add an edge loop to the base, add an edge loop to the top. And if I press 3 now, you'll see that that is much sharper on the bottom there. And rather than getting this dramatic arch here, we're getting a nice little tuck there. All right, so that's going to be a nice little area to use that in. I might also want to use it on the transition here. This kind of has a gumminess to it. It might be nice to just come in and insert an edge loop to tidy up this right here. So that way we have a little bit of a sharper turn on the top there. You also notice there's a lot of stretching through the base. This is where the multi-edge loop can be useful, but let's go ahead and add one to the bottom here so it doesn't get sucked up so far. So we'll go ahead and use a insert edge loop here. Mesh Tools, Insert Edge Loop, like so. And there we go. Now we're getting a much tighter look to that jar. Now, I might want to do some work on the interior too. For the top of a jar, I'm actually okay for it to round like that. That's usually how jars look, so I have no issue with that. But I might want to make it a little bit less dramatic on the inside, just using the insert edge loop here to add an internal ledge so it doesn't fall in quite so quickly. So that way we get that nice soft fall off. And then on the interior here, I might want to add an edge loop as well, just to get a nicer transition between these. Remember, you can hit G to repeat last tool used, so I can add those in. And while I'm looking at the interior, I'm also going to want to add one into the bottom here. Probably nice and tight. I'm going to undo that one. And then one right here as well. I'll just get a nice holding edge for the base there. And you'll see that'll pretty much do it for the interior. For the bottom, I'll want to do something similar. You can see here, we're getting those triangles. Now, this may not be an issue because are we going to see the bottom of the jar? But you do have to ask yourself, are you going to see the bottom of the jar? Jar see-through? You probably are. So how do we deal with this? Well, we can use the extrude tool to add one of the holding edges, and we can use the insert edge loop to add the other. So since we have the insert edge loop active, let's go ahead and use that right here to add in that edge loop. And you'll see that gives us nice tightness there, but we're still getting that triangulation. So we're going to go into face mode. I'm going to tab, and then I can hold down R to switch to scale and shift to just create a nice edge loop around that ring. And there we go. So now the jar is looking pretty darn good. The one last thing we might want to tackle is the large area of stretching here. Now you might be wondering, why do we care about this large stretching? You can see if I toggle between 1 and 3 here, that is where this edge loop gets jumped to. The reason we might want to change this deals with UVs. So if you remember, when it comes to texturing, we're going to use UVs, and UVs map the surface of the object. So when working with subdivision, you have to concern yourself with UV stretching, meaning that when you press that 3 button, your UVs are going to change locations. So since we generally are going to put labels on the front of jars, it's nice to have something a little bit more even here. Now I'm going to use the Insert Edge Loop tool to insert multiple edge loops. We're going to go ahead and switch this multi and set that to 4. And I'll just click right around the base here and add in 4. And I'll do the same on the inside so it has a even feel. Got to be careful there. It's accidentally selecting the outside. But now when I press 3, you'll see that those don't jump as much and we'll get a better surface for the purpose of texturing. So you have to think of how everything comes together. And that's why in the first project, we kind of took everything start to finish, because to understand some of the things you have to be aware of in modeling, you need to have that knowledge, okay? So reason why we're adding those extra edge loops, nothing structural, has everything to do with the UVs and how they're going to interact. Okay, so now that that's done, we can work our way up to the lid here. And if we press 3, the lid's going to be a bit less forgiving than the jar was. This one we need to add a lot of hold edges to, but more importantly, we need to resolve the triangle on top. So we're getting that issue where we're having that bend across a curved surface. And remember, we don't like that with the triangles. So we're going to go into face mode. We'll just go ahead and do tab to select the top. And then I can hold shift with scale to add in the hold edge. And I might actually add in another one and just bring it inward, and maybe even add an edge loop afterwards. But if we press 3 now, you'll see that's a lot cleaner there, and we're getting the effect we're looking for. Now, the next thing I need is just some insert edge loops to tidy this up. So I'm going to do an insert edge loop, and we're just going to add a holding edge down here. Remember, I forgot to hit reset. Always hit reset when you're done. We're going to add a holding edge right here just to get a tighter little lip there. And you can see that makes a huge difference there in terms of getting that to read nicely. It looks like we also need one right here. So I'm going to hit G to access last tool. And that will give us a nice tight one right there. So that looks nice, giving us something very hard surface looking. Then we need a couple tight ones here to hold this and separate it from the base at a 90-degree angle. So that gives us a nice look. And then we can work our way into the inside. So always remember the inside here. For this one, I do want that softer edge on the lid, but I feel like lids actually have a harder edge on the inside. So I'm actually going to make that have a hold. And what you'll see is we'll get a nice hard edge here into a nice rounded edge. That's nice contrast there. And we'll just come in here and add hold edges here, hold edges here, hold edges here, here, just to get the interior rigid, and then here. And notice I can't on the top cap. We need to do an extrude to add in our offset. So let's go ahead and do that last extrude here. Just come into face mode here, grab these and scale with an extrude. And if you're familiar with jar lids, they quite often actually have a little bit of information on top. So we can actually shift inward one more time and then another time after that to create this little ledge. And this is kind of like a rubber seal that a lot of them tend to have. This is just a small detail you could get in there if you want. You don't need to, but since we're here, I'm going to add it in just so we have that higher fidelity detail. We'll just go ahead and move that down a little bit with an extrude. And you'll see now that we just get that nice little jar lid there. And we have the interior. And there we go. We have our jar. So I'm going to go ahead and set this to 0. And we'll have a nice jar lid there. Okay, so that is going to be the process there of modeling using extrudes and insert edge loop. So pretty complex looking object, very simple looking tools. So let's go ahead and save this, but let's clean it up first. Remember, clean up from previous. We're going to do 3 things. We're going to delete history, we're going to freeze transform, and we're going to name things. So I'm going to start by edit, delete all by type history. And notice there is a huge amount of history here. This is probably worth noting. We've talked a bit about history throughout the course, but when you get into modeling, this is when you get a lot of history. So you can see all those are the various tools we used. We're going to want to delete that out. Edit, delete all by type history, and clear that stack. Now you might be thinking, why do we want to delete that out? One of the reasons is when you load Maya and you have history, it actually goes back through that history and reconstructs it. So A, it generally takes longer to open, and B, it doesn't always get it right, especially if you're changing versions. So let's say Maya 2024 comes out, and there's a good chance you're already working in that because it probably is out right now while I'm making this course. What's going to happen is if you open your 2023 file, there is a chance it may not reconstruct the same way. But by deleting history, it makes it so you don't have to worry about that. Now, a story from a student I had, he created like an entire city inside of Maya. And, he came to me and said, hey, my file won't open. And I asked him if he deleted the history, and he said no. So he created this entire city, did a ton of work, saved, but because he didn't delete that history, Maya was taking so long trying to reconstruct it for this entire city that it just straight up wouldn't open. So be mindful of that. Deleting history is also good for file management. Now, once we're done with that, freeze transforms, if we haven't done that already, I forgot, modify freeze transforms. And then we can label this. So we'll go ahead and name this jar. And then we can name this jar lid. And that's good enough for now. So let's go ahead and save. I'll just do a save scene as. And we have this in our scenes for modeling. I'll go ahead and put this into props, and we can just make this prop called jar and save. And that will be our first prop. And we'll probably incorporate that some way into our scene. Okay, so hopefully you tackled that okay. I know I showed you about 100 different ways to do things, which once again, go with what's comfortable. But I want you to understand there's multiple ways to do it. And the key to getting fast at this is to explore those ways and to get comfortable with them and to not avoid them. Okay, for your final challenge, let's do the you do portion. What I want you to do is create a jar of your own. Feel free to go look for another design jar, or maybe try making something a little bit more exotic, like a potion shape, or even if you want to make something like a vase, without a lid, give that a try. Go ahead and make another shape on your own. Do this practice and see how much you retained. Okay, so go ahead and give that a shot, and then we'll continue our journey with modeling next.